Okay, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to the London Shipping Law Centre's global webinar series. My name is Grant Hunter. I'm a council member of the London Shipping Law Centre, and in my spare time, I work for BIMCO as Head of Contracts and Clauses. I will be chairing today's meeting. So before we begin, I think it's only fair that I should thank my co-organisers of the event, Rachel Hoyland, who's Senior Associate at Hill Dickinson, who you'll be hearing from shortly because she's going to set the scene for today's discussions, and Menelaus Kouzoupas, who's a partner at Stevenson Harwood, who will be working a little bit behind the scenes to help with the Q&A session as we get on later into the session. And thank you also, of course, to Gerard at the London Shipping Law Centre for helping us to set up the programme for today in the first place. Today, we're going to be discussing the topic of decarbonisation in shipping. I think it's fair to say that rarely does a day go by without the maritime press publishing some article related to the aspect of decarbonisation. It's what they call a hot topic. For example, today alone in Lloyd's List, they published headlines, "Shipping demands market-based measures debate at IMO." While tradeswinds were saying shipping wakes up to the need to tax carbon out of business. So, these are very, very topical issues, a daily part of what we're reading in the press. The reality is the shipping industry is facing a tsunami of regulations designed to bring about zero carbon shipping at some point in the future. It's a complex issue, and I don't think there is one single solution. But today, I think it's a rare privilege for us all to hear directly from the shipping industry's global regulators. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Roel Hoenders, who is from the IMO's Head of Air Pollution and Energy Efficiency Marine Environment Division. Roel is going to give us a regulator's insight and viewpoint on global regulations, local regulations, and various industry initiatives on decarbonisation. Now, when it comes to the practical implementation of decarbonisation regulations, this is largely dealt with at the coalface by ship owners and charterers together. To give charterers' perspective on decarbonisation, I'm pleased to have with us today Rasmus Bach-Nielsen, who's the Global Head of Fuel Decarbonisation at Trafigura. And Trafigura are the world's largest charterers of ships. I believe they're the largest ones anyway. And Rasmus is also the co-author of a proposal for an IMO-led global shipping industry decarbonisation programme. Ship owners themselves often consider themselves to bear the brunt of any new regulations. Decarbonisation may mean costly conversions to different fuel types and the addition of equipment and technology to make ship operations more efficient. They may even have to consider reducing speed and possibly even shutting out cargo to meet targets. To give the owner's perspective, I'm very pleased to have with me today my good colleague from BIMCO, Lars Robert Peterson, who's Deputy Secretary General, and who has himself been very vocal on some of the IMO's proposed decarbonisation measures. But before we begin, I think it's important to set the scene on decarbonisation and shipping so that we all understand the context and challenges faced by our industry. So I'm going to hand over to Rachel, who will introduce global warming, decarbonisation and shipping. Over to you, Rachel.
Thank you, Grant, for the warm welcome. As Grant said, I'm a shipping lawyer and senior associate at law firm Hill Dickinson in the UK, and decarbonisation and ESG are a particular focus for us and a topic that I'm speaking and writing on frequently. Now, as we all know, the shipping industry is complex, it's international and multifaceted. It's an industry in which interconnectedness is absolutely built in, and it's an industry which is used to doing business on the frontier. And these are important qualities because in unprecedented times, when human activities have wrought extensive changes on the planet, we really need, as Grant has hinted, a multitude of innovative and collaborative responses to the problems that we now need to solve. We're going to be talking about some of those responses in our webinar today. Beforehand, though, let's take a moment to be clear about the nature of the crisis and to talk about global warming and climate change. So, global warming. In the simplest of terms, carbon dioxide emissions produced predominantly from the burning of fossil fuels are increasing the insulative properties of the atmosphere, with the result that global temperatures are increasing and the climate is changing. So decarbonisation of the shipping industry means finding a way for the industry to operate without producing carbon dioxide emissions. And climate change, what does that mean? Well, this is the painful part, but I think it's important that we are open-eyed about it. The climate change means the melting of land and sea ice. It means thermal expansion of the ocean and rising sea levels. With that, it means the loss of low-lying coastal margins and the homes, livelihoods, and potentially lives of millions of people. It means acidification of the oceans as more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is dissolved in them. It means droughts, floods, typhoons, heat waves, and bushfires. It means changes to weather patterns which disrupt the reproductive cycles of wildlife and the cultivation of crops. It means loss of ecosystems, biodiversity, and species. It means smaller harvests, or none at all. It means a threat to global food security and an increase of vector-borne diseases such as malaria. It means changes that may result in the mass migration of people, in conflict, and in social collapse. And these are not distant prospects. We are well past the point at which business as usual will continue to produce a climate as usual. And the political mandate to halt our damaging impact on the environment already exists at the highest level. Now, what of shipping in this landscape? Well, there are two stories to tell in shipping in relation to global warming. And one is that the industry makes a significant adverse contribution. So the fourth IMO greenhouse gas study published in 2018 reported that at that time, the shipping industry was producing over 1 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide annually, that it was responsible for almost 3% of carbon dioxide emissions globally, and that despite improvements in ship efficiency, the increase in volume of seaborne trade meant that the position overall was worse than it had been in the previous reporting period, and that it was set to continue to worsen. So shipping is undoubtedly a part of the problem. However, the second story to tell in shipping is that shipping is the most efficient mode for transportation of goods. Around 90% of the world's trade is moved by sea. It's been said recently, no shipping, no shopping. And indeed, we might add to that, no construction, no manufacturing, no eating, and no fuel. So the potential impact of decarbonising the industry is enormous, and it stands to potentially be the backbone in a completely new era of emissions neutral global trade. Decarbonising the industry presents us with an urgent but an exciting challenge. We are confronted with a crisis, but this is also a time which is rich in opportunities, and the industry has the advantage of interconnectedness. It has the advantage of doing business on new frontiers. If it can collaborate effectively, and if all stakeholders can play a part, it can rise to this challenge. And so I think that brings us to ask the question, what is it that we can all do, and what is it that we are doing? So having set the scene, I have pleasure in passing to Roel Honders of the International Maritime Organization to talk us through the global regulatory picture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you very much for this introduction to the work of the IMO. Grant, if you can put up the slides, that would be helpful. So as Rachel mentioned, I was requested to talk you to the regulatory framework of the IMO, and I've been given about 15 to 20 minutes to walk you through, and I will try to do that as quick and efficient as possible. There has been a lot of regulatory developments in relation to energy efficiency, but also regulating air pollution from ships by the IMO in the past 10, 15 years. And I'll quickly go through that as the presentation comes up. In the meanwhile, I'll just, there we are. Thank you very much. I suppose that every one of you is familiar with the IMO, and just to, as kind of as an introduction as well to this presentation, obviously the 174 member states that are the main decision makers at the IMO are represented in our meetings, but in addition to that, there are currently 143 observer organizations, many of which participate very actively in IMO discussions. And BIMCO is one of them. And let me also thank BIMCO for taking the initiative of organizing this webinar and giving us the floor. We obviously appreciate the inputs from BIMCO in all of our meetings, and they largely drive kind of the discussions within IMO meetings and provide technical and scientific input. Next slide, please. As Rachel mentioned, the regulatory framework from the IMO regulating air pollution as well as energy efficiency of ships is done through Marple Nx6. I won't go into detail about the background and the history of the annex, but it's important to note that the 99 states that have ratified the annex represent around 97% of the world tonnage. And therefore, amending the legal text takes time. The annex contains binding requirements, and any discussion about amending this legal text obviously is confronted with different views, different member states, different organizations, industry groups that all need to be concealed and put together in a set of amendments. Marple Nx6 regulates both what we call air pollution, sulfur emissions, NOx emissions, and energy efficiency of ships, and I will come back to both in more detail. Next slide, please. And just to give you an indication of let's say, the impact of air pollution requirements of Marple Nx6, just to recall and go back to the global sulfur cap, or IMO 2020, as we call it, that took effect last year on the 1st of January. And it was a major amendment or a change in the environmental performance of the industry, of the global shipping industry. And the decision taken by IMO member states to cut the sulfur content of fuel led to a 77% drop in sulfur emissions, which of course resulted in huge health benefits for citizens all around the world. What's important to keep in mind of those amendments is that the thorough preparation, the cooperation between member states, ports, the shipping industry, and fuel providers really showed what can be done if we cooperate. And that's a very important lesson that has been learned from IMO 2020, and that is relevant also for implementation of the greenhouse gas strategy. Next slide, please. So where are we in terms of energy efficiency and regulating CO2 emissions from ships? We're actually, this year, 2021, is the 10th year anniversary of Chapter 4. Chapter 4 is the chapter in Marple Nx6 that lays down the various requirements, mandatory requirements, regulating energy efficiency of ships. And I put together quickly on the slides a quick overview of what has been done since 2011. And two of the main instruments that have been agreed upon back then are the EEDI, the so-called Energy Efficiency Design Index, as well as the Ship Energy Efficiency Management Plan. Both are mandatory requirements. The EEDI is a construction requirement for new build ships to become more energy efficient over time. And we're actually currently in phase 2 of the EEDI, which contains more stringent energy efficiency requirements compared to the earlier versions. And a phase 3 of the EEDI will enter into force very quickly. The SEMP is a plan that needs to be kept on board by the ship, and which should outline the various energy efficiency measures that a ship can take in order to keep its operational energy efficiency performance under control. Next slide, please. So just to give you a snapshot of what the EEDI is, on the right hand, this is actually the legal text in Marple Nx6, outlining for each of the relevant ship types what are the energy efficiency requirements. And those energy efficient requirements are actually reduction factors that are compared to a reference line, and that reference line is set out on the left side of the slide. Next slide, please. Another very important requirement that has been subscribed into Marple Nx6, and which actually leads many of the discussions that we're having today, and I'll come back to that later, is the IMO Fuel Consumption Collection Database. The amendments requiring ships of 5,000 GT and above to report and submit their annual fuel consumption data to the IMO entered into force actually as the first year of reporting in 2019. And that information of around 27,000 ships, so their annual fuel consumption data, has been analyzed and has been aggregated into a report which IMO, the Secretariat, has issued, and that will be discussed later this year. And you can see on the right-hand side, actually, the bar on the upper part of the slide highlights the number actually of ships reporting their fuel consumption in deadweight tonnage. And it's quite interesting to note that in terms of deadweight tonnage, the yellow part of the bar represents only 5 flag administrations. So when we speak about how to reduce emissions, it's obvious that in terms of deadweight tonnage, 5 main flag states are responsible for a large part of the fuel consumption. The lower bar indicates, and you can see that the 3 main bars, which are the bulker, the tanker, and the container ships, which represent or actually confirm what we to a large extent already knew. These 3 shipping segments are responsible for the main fuel consumption today. And with this information, we will actually have more scientific or evidence that will guide our regular discussions on reducing the carbon intensity of international shipping. Next slide, please. Just to come back, and both, I think Grant and Rachel mentioned in their introduction market-based measures, and you were right, today in the press there was again a reference to market-based measures. And just to kind of go back a little bit to what has been discussed already in the IMO almost, well, about 8 years ago actually, and a number of years before 2013, was what kind of market-based measures could be introduced to regulate further ship emissions. And the market-based measures has been a very complex discussion in the past in IMO. And in 2013, IMO actually agreed to suspend the discussion on market-based measures because it was not possible to come to an agreement, and instead focused actually on a more technical mandatory requirements that are now listed in Marple Nx6. I won't go into detail in what the different market-based measures are, but of course, what's important to keep in mind is that the price, or basically the market-based measures, are designed to put a price on fuel consumption, on carbon, and in that way to bridge the rather big gap between the price gap between the use of heavy fuel oils or fossil fuel and the low carbon or the zero carbon alternatives. And there are various, of course, market-based measures consisting either of levies, taxes, or emission trading schemes, which are generally based on a cap and trade or total cap for emissions, under which the different allowances can be traded. Next slide, please. Now, this was all these earlier discussions within the IMO and market-based measures were concluded in 2013, but the world has changed enormously since then. And Rachel, you mentioned it in the introduction, the challenge, the climate challenge is huge and we need to act. And obviously the Paris Agreement was a big move in mobilizing action across all the different sectors around the world. What is interesting to note is that the ship emissions were not as such covered by the Paris Agreement. And this is basically, this comes down to calculating and reporting emissions from international aviation and maritime transport on the basis of the so-called IPCC reporting guidelines, which actually state that countries, they should report on international emissions from maritime transport and aviation, but those totals are excluded from the national total. However, as was mentioned in the beginning again, the share of these international transport or the international maritime transport emissions are around 2.89% of the world's total emissions, so around 3%, and they have actually increased since 2012. So there is definitely need for further collective action. Next slide, please. So, and that actually, that need for additional action led to the adoption in 2018. So about 3 years after the adoption of the Paris Agreement, to the adoption of the IMO initial strategy on the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. And again, also the adoption of the IMO strategy was a landmark decision and actually reflected a lot of discussions within the IMO among member states, among different groups of member states representing developing countries, developed countries, and also different industry groups. What is important is that there are different levels of ambition agreed by the member states and laid down in the strategy. And the first level of ambition is actually to continue to strengthen the requirements, the energy efficiency requirements for new builds, to further strengthen the EEDI. Another level of ambition is to reduce carbon intensity by 40% by 2030. And we're currently working on concrete amendments to Marple Nx6 to achieve that. But most importantly, the 2050 level of ambition, which is to reduce total greenhouse gas emissions by at least 50% by 2050. The strategy also speaks about phasing out emissions as a matter of urgency as soon as possible in this century. And important to keep in mind, the initial strategy, as the name already says, needs to be revised by 2023. Next slide, please. So the strategy contains, as the name already says, it's a strategy. So it doesn't contain any binding requirements, but it does contain a list of what we call the so-called candidate measures. And the candidate measures are divided in 3 different groups: the short-term measures, the mid-term measures, and the long-term measures that all need to be implemented or need to be agreed upon by IMO in a different time window. And the short-term measures need to be agreed by IMO up to 2023, the mid-term measures until 2030, and the long-term measures beyond 2030. There are a number of short-term measures that we are discussing concretely today: the further improvement of the EEDI, on which additional amendments were adopted recently, last November; the establishment of the so-called International Maritime Research Board, or the IMRB; and also the further development of technical and operational energy efficiency measures, and I'll come back to that later. Now, market-based measures in the IMO strategy are actually grouped under the midterm measures, and as such need to be agreed upon in the period between 2023 and 2030. Next slide, please. But what we have seen actually is that since the adoption of the initial strategy in 2018, that regulation or the strategy in itself has really driven innovation and initiatives around the world. And our friends and colleagues from the Getting to Zero Coalition have actually produced a very interesting recent overview of the various zero emission pilot projects around the world. And we can see that since their last reporting, which was about half a year ago, the number of projects focused on zero emission marine fuel, zero emission technology have really grown rapidly. So we're happy to see that through the IMO strategy, by setting a target for 2050, these projects are emerging around the world. And you can see on the lower part in the left slide what kind of alternative fuel projects are taking up these days, in which parts of the world these are emerging well, as we speak. And also interesting to note is how important the public funding for today is in terms of kickstarting these various projects. One of the tasks for IMO is, of course, as a UN organization, to make sure that also developing countries can be part of this transition and can actually see some of the projects in their own countries. Next slide, please. Coming then to where we are today, and again, we need to have this information in mind when we start our regulatory discussions. And I think, Rachel, you actually looked into the 4th IMO greenhouse gas study, and this was something that was agreed by the IMO or approved by the IMO last November and is published on our website now. The study is a very comprehensive study providing a good overview of where we are today in terms of emissions. And you can see actually the inventories or the emission growth since 2012, and as well as the projections for the future. What you can see on the lower slide on the left-hand side is actually where we are today, 2020, compared to 2008, which is the base year of the IMO greenhouse gas strategy. So the blue line shows the emissions. The 2 lines above that, so the orange and the red one, are actually indicating the increase of seaborne traffic and seaborne trade. So there is a clear decoupling in terms of emissions, and that is a good sign. So whereas the total amount of trade has been growing, emissions have not grown with the same pace. Nonetheless, if you look at the projections, which are on the right-hand side, under the current regulation scenario, the emissions are still projected to grow, whereas the IMO greenhouse gas strategy actually foresees a 50% reduction of greenhouse gases by 2050. So that obviously indicates that the measures that have been taken so far are not sufficient in order to curb the trend and to move towards a 50% greenhouse gas reduction. Next slide, please. So one of the concrete discussions that have been taking place in the past year, and we're actually quite keen, or we're quite happy to see that despite the COVID conditions and despite the fact that IMO has not been able to have any physical meetings in London over the past year, we managed to have a set of new amendments to Marple Nx6 approved last November. And that set of amendment focuses on reducing carbon intensity of shipping by 40% by 2030 compared to 2008, which is the baseline of the greenhouse gas strategy. So it's important to keep in mind that these set of amendments focus on reducing carbon intensity, and it's not focused on absolute greenhouse gas emission reduction. So the carbon intensity is the amount of carbon emitted compared to the cargo transported. So it's basically compared to a car. You can have a very efficient car, but if you drive more, you can still emit more emissions than previously. So what we're trying to do is reduce this energy efficiency per ton cargo. The short-term measure, as was approved by IMO member states last November, is a so-called goal-based approach, and it contains both a technical and an operational approach to achieve this carbon intensity target by 2030. The measure applies to all ships, so including existing ships, obviously with some differentiation depending on what ship type and size, but compared to the EEDI, which is a requirement that applies only to new build ships, this new measure will apply to all ships as of 2023, when the measure is expected to enter into force. The overall goal of the measure is to actually reduce the carbon intensity, or have set out a trajectory to reduce the ship's carbon intensity between 2023 and 2030 to achieve the 40% of the global fleet. You can see on the lower part where we are actually today, or 2018. This is a figure again from the IMO greenhouse gas strategy in terms of reducing carbon intensity. And depending on the carbon intensity indicator that you use, so either the AER or the EEOI, some progress or considerable progress has already been made. And the objective of these amendments is actually to bridge the remaining gap between the figures that you see in the right box and the 40% by 2030. Next slide. Now, what do these amendments require? First of all, a technical certification, and this is based on the so-called Energy Efficiency Existing Ship Index, so the EEXI compared to the EEDI, which stands for Design for New Builds. This is a certification that needs to be done at the first survey following the entry into force of the amendment, so that's early in 2023. It will most likely, in most of the cases, require a so-called engine power limitation in order to reduce the ship speed. On top of that, the amendments require an operational approach, and that is kind of an annual reduction of the ship's carbon intensity. And this carbon intensity will be measured on the basis of the ship's annual fuel consumption, which is already reported to IMO. And based on that fuel consumption, or this fuel consumption will be compared to a so-called carbon intensity indicator reduction factor, which will be specific for a ship type and a ship size. That performance will then be verified by the administration and rated. And the rating consists of an A to E rating, where E is the lowest rating. Based on that rating, a ship will get a statement of compliance, and with that statement of compliance, it can continue its operations. When a ship is rated for 3 consecutive years as D or for 1 year as E, that ship actually has to put in place a so-called plan of corrective actions to improve its carbon intensity, and so has to take additional measures in order to comply with the carbon intensity reduction lines. The SAMP, which is an instrument, as I explained, has been included in Marple Nx6 for quite a while, will be enhanced and will be audited in order to verify the rating and the operational carbon intensity. Next slide, please. And just to give you a graphic indication again of how this works, so on the left hand, the EEXI, the lower slide provides the various reduction factors that need to be attained by 2023 for the different ship types and ship sizes. It's similar to the EEDI. On the right-hand side, a little bit in a graphic representation, how the various grading of the bands for the rating system will work in practice. So there will be a regression line for various ship types between 2023 and 2030. And depending on the performance of the ship against that regression line, it will be rated. Next slide, please. Coming then to the end of this presentation and giving a bit of an outlook of what we expect in terms of discussions in the months to come, particularly at MEPC 76, which will take place in June of this year. So we will have a consideration of these draft amendments on the short-term measures that I just presented in view of their adoption. And that consideration will be done together with a broad set of guidelines which have been developed, technical guidelines on how all these various elements on the EEXI, on the CEI, on the rating will work in practice, which have to be considered and finalized as well if the amendments can be adopted in June. If the amendments are adopted, as I mentioned, the amendments will enter into force in 2023, setting out the pathway for shipping to reduce carbon intensity by 40%. We will also have a discussion or a further consideration of the proposal on the so-called International Maritime Research and Development Board, which is a proposal by a number of member states and industry associations to put in place a mandatory $2 fuel levy. And on the basis of that fuel levy, over a period of 10 years, there should be a fund created of around $5 billion in order to fund various projects around the world supporting the decarbonization of the industry. We'll also expect to have a discussion in June on a work plan and working arrangements within the IMO to further structure the discussions, the very complicated discussions that we're going to have on mid and long-term measures, including on those market-based measures. And this plan will also set out how we can structure the discussion on the revision of the initial IMO strategy, as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. This strategy needs to be revised by 2023, and we expect that this will be a complex discussion about what the target for 2050 or maybe even 2040 in terms of greenhouse gas reduction should be for the global industry. And finally, you may have heard that there has been a proposal submitted by the Marshall Islands, which is of course the third biggest flag state, as well as the Solomon Islands, for a market-based measure, which will also be considered in June. And that market-based measure is based on a $100 carbon levy to be put in place in the future as well to further incentivize the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from shipping, but in particular to bridge the gap to low carbon fuels. Next slide, please. And finally, just to give a quick overview of a couple of other initiatives, we're working as well on the development of so-called life cycle greenhouse gas assessment guidelines. This is very important in order to have a good overview of what the total greenhouse gas emissions of different alternative fuels are. So for instance, LNG, there's a lot of discussion about what is the impact of methane emissions from LNG. So this needs to be captured in these so-called life cycle greenhouse gas assessment guidelines. And we work together also with other UN organizations in order to exchange and to really promote to all of our member states, so not only the developed ones, but also the developing countries, on projects, ongoing projects and pilots, looking at the let's say, the uptake of low carbon fuels. And maybe to close off this presentation, it is important that we work together with the entire membership of the IMO, but also with the wider industry, the maritime industry, but also with other stakeholders, such as banks, such as yourself, in order to, collectively actually make the transition to decarbonization possible. And we've also, in that regard, have initiated a number of new projects and initiatives, and also continue to step up our role in providing support to developing countries that will help them to be part of this transition to low carbon shipping. And with that, thank you very much. I think there's one last slide referring to the Secretary General and highlighting that, of course, if we work together, we can ensure that shipping moves to this really sustainable, efficient, and decarbonized future that we all aspire. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Roel. That was very interesting indeed, and I think really gave us a good overview, just the sheer breadth and depth of all the regulations and measures and proposals that are out there to try to tackle this carbon issue and help bring down the carbon emissions in the shipping industry. So perhaps not surprisingly, it has thrown up a couple of questions during your presentation. And there's one question that's come up on my screen here, which I think has often left me scratching my head a little bit as well. It's from James Turner, if I can just read it out. Why did the IMO take 2008 as the benchmark against which to measure emission reductions? Everyone knows that it was an all-time high for emissions in the final months before the financial crash. The result is that emissions can actually go up for the next few years. Does Roel think there is a reason why, or this is the reason why, the US and the EU are taking matters into their own hands in terms of controlling shipping emissions?
Good question, and a question that was debated quite extensively when the strategy was adopted. And I think the main, if you look back at the discussion back in 2018, the main kind of reason for keeping to 2008 is kind of to have a clear trend in emissions and to set out or to have information on what happened in those years, to see what was the impact of the financial crisis, to see what is kind of the growth in maritime trade, and to have a period actually that reflected all these trends, all these actually impacts on emissions, on trade, in order to set out the levels of ambition for the future.
All right, thank you very much indeed for answering that, Roel. I'm now going to turn to Rasmus to get the charterer's perspective on this. Now, Trafigura, you're a major user of shipping transportation, the largest charterers in the world, and you certainly have a very strong commitment to reducing carbon emissions. So it'll be interesting to hear your perspective on what Roel said in terms of, is the IMO doing enough and quickly enough, and is the regulatory way on its own enough, or should we be looking at other measures as well? So if I can pass the floor to you, Rasmus.
Thank you very much, Grant. It's a pleasure to be here. I mean, it's a topic that I could speak about for hours. I have 7 minutes, so I'll try and make it very brief and maybe speak a bit faster than I normally do. Why is Trafigura so engaged into this topic? Of course, it's a tremendously important matter for everyone. For Trafigura, we trade about 5.6 million barrels of oil per day. So that's 5.5% of world daily consumption that we trade. We're the biggest metals and mineral trader. We're a big LNG trader. We run a very significant fleet, and we have very significant charter of ships. So we have carbon all around us. We have $61 billion of credit lines, and we have taken a principled view that in order for our infrastructure to decarbonize, we need regulation. Next slide, please. In terms of regulation and what is required and where are we? Today, where we are, the regulatory framework does not provide sufficient opportunity for the industry to decarbonize sooner rather than later. For Trafigura, where we have our Scope 3 emissions, which is 78% of our emissions, we know and we can see for how the industry is shaped today, it's not realistic for us to decarbonize in the pace that we require ourselves and what society requires from us. We have seen from the past, and this is ballast water treatment regulation, from sulfur regulation, The bill sits with the owners and it's not effective. Well, it has been working for what it needed to do, but in order for the transition to decarbonize, for shipping to decarbonize, we need the strongest possible regulatory framework. That led to our proposal for an IMO-led global shipping industry decarbonization program, which we launched in September last year. Before you move on to next slide, I'll just say an initiative by the Global Maritime Forum is the Sea Cargo Charter, which is a reporting mechanism where owners voluntarily and charters voluntarily report in their emissions, which means we're building up a reporting tool where we are standardizing reporting of emissions and where people, including the charters and the owners, can be held accountable on backwards basis, which is great. About our IMO proposal, next slide, please. So what is the challenge and why do we need to do it? Again, today, if there's no levy on marine fuels, it would be hard for pension funds and others to invest into the renewable space because the challenge is who's going to offtake it. And if there's uncertainty on offtake, i.e. the ship owners and subsequently the charters, then how can we encourage investments? So we are of a very, very firm view that we need to introduce a carbon levy, and we believe it's very best done by the IMO, as it is the global governing body for shipping. So the way we have structured our proposal is in a practical way where we have factored in various things, also decision-making processes within the IMO, but also what we see and believe is the right thing for the industry. And what we've proposed is by far the biggest pot of the funds collected goes back into the industry, i.e. it goes in to subsidize the use of low and zero carbon fuels, which means that you cost neutralize these fuels, which means that ship owners are encouraged to change engines, and we know that the engines are ready by 24 and 25, depending if you're new building or retrofit. And besides also for the people who are off-takers of the $1 billion of investments into renewable fuels, well, in order to off-take these fuels for a 10-year basis, well, you need certainty that there's demand. So it comes hand in hand, and we need to lift it on a macro level. And this is why you see Trafigura going so strongly into this topic to push things forward, because we see that is absolutely what is required. And to give you an example of, let's say, what green ammonia today is costing on forward basis, and this is all the under the radar projects which are currently being worked on, then green ammonia as of today on forward basis will cost between 450 to 500 euros per metric tons. And obviously, with a calorific value 2.2 times less than the current fuels, it's highly uneconomical, and companies will not be able to offtake these fuels in scale. And what we're talking about is scale and transition. So we believe that it has to, primarily part of the funds has to go in to subsidize the use of low and zero carbon fuels. We have established a fuel benchmark. I come to that shortly from now. We don't believe a significant amount of funds should go to R&D. We have, as an example, gone ahead with American University last year, 2 years ago actually, coming out conclusions last year about transport fuels of the future, a number of PhD professors, etc. And then the conclusion was very clear. They have to be hydrogen-based as they subsequently don't contain carbon. There's two contenders in that. It's green methanol and it's green ammonia. Green methanol destiny probably rests on the ability to capture carbon. A lot of technology providers for sure today must be looking into that. We cannot say with certainty if they will succeed in capturing carbon. And then the cleanest fuel, the way it looks today with the information that we have today, looks definitely to be green ammonia. And I have a slide at the end here on the carbon content of these fuels. So a small part potentially to go into R&D, and then a small part of the funds also to go into small island states and developing countries who potentially will suffer from increased transportation costs. But we don't believe it should be a large proportion of the funds, because we need the industry to go and be encouraged to invest in the propulsion, and we need the off-takers of the fuels to go and off-take it so pension funds can invest the billions and billions of dollars. The good news is the funds are there, the off-takers are there, and the owners, they probably want to change, and I think probably likely certain that they would like to change. Next slide, please. In terms of how we have structured it, is that IMO is to set a CO2 benchmark on each transportation fuel, and there's not a lot of them, so it's not a difficult task as such if you look at what IMO is capable of. And as Roald said before, ideally what we believe it should be on a full life cycle assessment basis, so you also account for methane, slippage, etc. on LNG. There is a benchmark established. We have drawn inspiration from the California low carbon fuel standards, which is where you have an intensity benchmark, and then you see if charter ships above the benchmark, charters gets penalized. What that means is that charters will change behavior, and what we need to see is behavioral change. But it has to happen on an equal level playing field, i.e. regulation, carbon levy, because the numbers are so significantly out of whack in terms of what people can afford that we do need the regulation. Again, when regulation happens, everything will become so clear, and there will be such a transition that is completely unseen, unheard. And the way we see it, it's a historical challenge. There's historical responsibility on all of us, including IMO member delegates, politicians, everyone, but it's also an historical opportunity because we all want it and we need it. Yeah, next slide, please. Just a little bit about what I said before. Again, carbon intensity profiles are set. We set the benchmarks. If you charter higher, above the benchmark, you pay. And if you charter lower, you get subsidized. Next slide, please. What we have seen as Trafigura, and now I just go one step back, since we made our proposal in September last year, first there was a lot of, okay, it's very interesting, we think it's good. Within IMO member delegates, there was a lot of critique, and they said, this is not possible. We did the market-based measures in 2013-14, nobody wanted it, it's not realistic. We have spent endless amount of hours speaking with IMO member states, with NGOs, politicians, etc. Slowly and gradually, sentiment has changed, also helped very much by society and requirements from society. But what we have seen is a change in belief, significant change in belief. And yes, we also spoke to the small island states, and we don't agree in the revenue sharing from their proposal. But what they have done is to bring this on the global IMO agenda, which is great, because suddenly it's a topic that will be addressed. And now we see by the week, people coming on board that we do need a carbon levy. Ship owners have realized that this is what it takes for them not to be sitting with the buck and the bill, because with regulation, then you have clarity. Yeah. And about sort of the transition in sentiment on where we are moving. 2 months ago, I was on a DC think tank, Friends of the Ocean conference with a climate ambassador of a Scandinavian country. He said, quote unquote, carbon levy will never happen. I've been in the process before, and it will not happen. I was, furious. I was very disappointed, because how can a climate ambassador from a Scandinavian country be so lacking ambition so severely? And what we see today, and again, that Scandinavian country is now also coming on board, carbon levy market-based measures. We see it, and this is tremendous. And a lot of people are now changing, and we're getting where we need to be. And again, where we need to be is that corporations need to be able to decarbonize their infrastructure. And again, only by regulation can that happen. I could talk a lot more, but conscious of time, just briefly about fuels on a well-to-propeller basis and tank-to-propeller basis. Again, the green hydrogen and the green ammonia and green methanol stands out. Why is it not 100% reduction? Well, there is an engine injection as well of regular fuels, yeah. And that also goes to the tank to propeller, where that's probably not 100%, that could probably more likely be 97% or something like that. But by far the most friendly fuels on a CO2 basis, and that's where we believe the future lies for the shipping industry. The very great news is it's feasible, it's becoming realistic, and I truly believe that decarbonization will happen, and it will happen much faster than what everybody believes. And COP26 will be the complete game changer for this. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Rasmus. I know we're a little pressed for time there, but that's certainly from what you've said of your proposal, and from what I've seen in the headlines today about ship owners calling for market-based measures to be accelerated and pushed to the forefront. It does sound like it's very much back on the agenda, which then brings me to my colleague Robert, who only in October last year was quoted in the press as taking a swipe at vague and disappointing IMO climate deal. So it would seem from your perspective, Robert, that things maybe perhaps a time for a change. Maybe we should be looking at market-based measures. Maybe there's a time to push for different things on the regulatory front as well. So let's hear from you.
Thank you, Grant, and thank you for hosting me here today. A lot have been said already by Rachel, Roel, and Rasmus on the issue, and you've already seen my slides actually. So I'm kind of a little bit there in the dark here of what I should cover. But and Grant, you mentioned these unfortunate, I must say, headlines in the press, because actually the article was a lot better and actually not criticizing per se, but pointing out a few realities of what IMO is about to enact, and we have to be realistic, and I think we can all agree that if a measure, fine as it looks, actually ends up by not reducing emission but actually contributing to more emissions, then had we not done it, then we should probably not do it, and that's really what we're pointing out. We have to be very careful about how we go about it, especially in terms of carbon intensity. What do we mean by transport work? And Roel, you just mentioned that we measure in the draft amendments. This is about cargo transported, but actually it's not. It's about a proxy for cargo transported, and that proxy, the deadweight of the ship, might actually not indicate efficient shipping as what we normally think of as efficient shipping. So we have to be careful about what we do. On the other hand, Roel, you also pointed out to the fourth IMO greenhouse gas study, and that's where we start. The starting point of our discussion, really, where are we today? What does it look like? And the clear decoupling in, I'd say, 2009. That's actually where suddenly the trade starts to increase and emissions continue to decrease. Obviously, the trigger event was the global financial crisis we had back then. But interestingly, since then we have seen shipping emission wobbling, year from year, going up and down a little bit. And I'm sure that when we get to 2020, we will see a drop again in actual emissions. Just to see in 2021, it's probably picking up again a bit. It's all reflecting what you say, the contemporary shipping markets in those years. Interestingly, the total amount of trade that we perform just continues to increase year by year. And decarbonizing shipping is not about decarbonizing one ship, it's about decarbonizing all the ships. And when we look at this ship efficiency drive, ship efficiency can only bring so much when the total demand for transport continues to grow. But we need to decarbonize. We need to go to zero. That's the vision in the strategy. And I think that's something we should always keep in mind, that the strategy is clear on the end point. The discussion is about the stepping stones to get there and the time frame we're talking about. And I think Rasmus said a lot of very clever words there in how fast the transition can probably happen when we get the market forces to actually drive the transition, rather than what you say, desire to do it. Because desire can only bring us so far, and so far is not enough to decarbonize. Next slide, please. I talked about transport demand. We saw how transport demand have risen since actually already from 1990 up to 2018, and it's just a continuous rise of transport demand. And the question is, what happens in the future? Transport demand is projected in the fourth greenhouse gas study under various economic scenarios. And we have to be careful how we look at these economic scenarios for the future. Some of them are from DreamWorks Incorporated, others are from more reliable sources like the OECD, and I tend to believe that the recent OECD projections on future economic development are probably the most sound way to go about it. Nevertheless, these projections, based on the, what you say, rather modest OECD projections for the future, still shows that trade continues to climb, and we need to break this continuous rise and this idea that we can improve our efficiency a little bit and thereby decarbonize. We cannot. We need to increase our efficiency to a degree which totally outperforms any known technology when we talk about fossil fuels. We need to go to new types of fuels really to bring about decarbonization. So IMO talks about or has set an initial target of 50% of the 2008 level absolute emissions by 2050. Can we get there? That's, some say we can, some say we cannot, others say we need to totally decarbonize by 2035. Actually, it's an academic discussion, you can say, because until we have the solutions ready and we have them ready in a form where they are actually making sense from a business perspective to implement in the industry, we don't see the transition start running. And if we can meet 50% by 2050, we can probably also meet a bit more, maybe a lot more. It's all about the pace of transition. We need to get the transition running, and we are not even started that yet. Next slide, please. Future emissions, as projected in the fourth greenhouse gas study, as business as usual, as was mentioned by Roel. What does it really mean? It means the model has not anticipated further regulatory measures to reduce emissions, but it has included efficiency improvements that are expected to happen in the years to come. And as we can see for the lower of these trajectories, it's more or less stable emission level since 2018. But clearly, we need to break this. We need to have this substantial transition. We cannot, 5% improvement brings us nowhere in terms of the overall targets. So it actually means we need to have the introduction of zero emission fuels and technologies in some ships. And we need to accelerate, you could say, the uptake of this type of technology in the whole fleet. That is going to take some time. And the question is, how long time is that? Is it a generation of ships, meaning 20 years, or is it less than that because it becomes uneconomical or unsustainable to actually be one of the, you could say, fossil dinosaurs operating the legacy technology? We don't know that, but we need to get the transition running. Next slide, please. So getting the technology, the new fuels ready to the market is often said, well, we don't need that. Well, we need some of this done because this technology is not yet there for mass application in the very large ocean-going ships, and I think that's really what we're talking about. It's not what you say basic R&D we're talking about. It is upscaling the technology readiness level of the various solutions that we know will become part of the future. So there is a need to do some of this. We don't. There is a proposal from the industry, which is now a joint member states industry proposal to be discussed at the next meeting for a $5 billion fund. Where we collect money on a levy-based fund based on the fuel consumption and spend this in a structured manner on these things. But what will drive transition is not that things are available, because as Rasmus said, if the price for the fuel is twice or 3 times what we pay now, you know, there is frankly little incentive to go down this road. And we cannot have a transition for all ships like 2020 in one day. We need the transition to happen gradually, ship by ship, over a time span of probably more than 1 decade, probably 2 decades, a generation of ships. And that means ships of the old technology, of the old fuels, will actually trade side by side with ships of the new fuels, of the new technologies. And we need the market to allow that to happen in an economically sustainable manner. And that's our challenge. And that's why the industry today has announced jointly a submission to IMO that this discussion on market-based measures needs to be kickstarted at IMO soon as possible. We are not suggesting the model for it because it is a political minefield to have this discussion. I think the discussions we had earlier at IMO is a proof of this. We know the ambition of member states are certainly different from one state to another, but we need to have this done. We need the market-based measures to make it a commercial reality to do the transition. It needs to be the right thing and the economically sustainable thing to do to take the sustainable option rather than the fossil option. Next slide, please. That's kind of where I have taken it, Grant, and I think it resonates well with what was said by Rasmus. I was not so detailed on the actual what it is we need, but we need it, that's for sure. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Robert. Much appreciated. I think, the one thing we've touched upon during the discussions, but haven't really gone into a lot of detail, I would consider to be something for all the panelists to respond to. And for me, it's kind of the elephant in the room. And it's this issue that we're hearing about carbon intensity indicators and the concept of continuous vessel improvement on an annual basis. And we've got some questions in from our audience here as well, which I think, something I'd be interested in hearing the answer to as well. Under the CII sort of proposals, ships need to be rated from A to D, depending on how efficient they are, but on an annual basis need to do things in order to improve their efficiency, or at least maintain their efficiency. So one of the questions we've got here from Vicky Tarbert is that I see that a vessel rated D or E has to provide a plan to improve its efficiency, whatever, on an annual basis, but it's unclear what the consequences will be if the ship owner fails to properly implement that plan or still fails to meet its targets. Will there be penalties, or will there be some sort of non-compliance thing? I think that's not entirely clear from the regulations what the consequences would be of failing to comply, just maintaining sort of rating as a D or an E or whatever. Maybe I could start with the rule on that one as sort of the regulator.
Thank you, Grant, and thanks for the question. It's a very pertinent question. To be honest, the short answer is no, there are no immediate legal implications of the corrective action plan. So as was highlighted in the presentation, or was mentioned as well, I think by Robert, there is, and I think there was another question about that as well, there is still some uncertainty about how the carbon intensity indicators will work in practice. The carbon intensity indicators, the most prominent one that's likely to be used is the so-called AER. The AER is a carbon intensity indicator that can be calculated on the basis of the data that is already reported to the IMO under the fuel consumption requirement. And therefore, it's the most likely carbon intensity indicator that will be used, but it has its weaknesses. As Robert mentioned, and in order to allow let's say the industry member states to gain a bit more experience with how these carbon intensity indicators will function in practice, for the time being, there's no legal implication in case of a D or E rating and the corrective action plan. This was also done in order to allow certain developing countries that had some concerns about the amendments to get them on board, to get more experience about how the whole system would function in practice. But what is important as well is that the draft amendments actually foresee a revision clause in 2026. And so this is one of the elements on which we expect that there will be discussion in the revision of the amendments in view of further strengthening the requirements around the corrective action plan and possible legal implications.
Thank you very much for that, Roel. Rasmus and Robert. Okay, this has, there's we've just heard there's no legal implication for not meeting or getting your standard or maintaining this rating. How does this translate down into the commercial world when we have to put together a charter party to deal with continuous vessel improvement? Who's going to be taking responsibility for all this, maintaining these ratings, putting capital investment into putting new equipment on board? And I think I also mentioned right at the beginning of my presentation, someone's already picked me up on this concept that maybe in order to maintain or improve your rating from year to year, you might have to reduce speed and shut out cargo. These are all things that have been proposed, all in relation to the CII. So what are your views on how are we going to get this to work? Who's going to be responsible? Rasmus.
I think the Sea Cargo Charter is great for this purpose. Actually, it's going to be a standardized reporting tool, which also will follow IMO mechanisms. Yeah, over time. So Sea Cargo Charter will be amended over time. That's the plan. But the Sea Cargo Charter is a reporting requirement that over time will become more and more the standard in our industry. So I think there you will see the charters. Actually, as many charters have it now, they have a reporting requirement in the standard spot charter terms where owners are required to report emissions. So I think over time it will sort of be self-fulfilling that all charters will require to understand what are the owner's CO2 profile of the ships that are being chartered. So that will drive a change in terms of what is required. And then, of course, the policing is more difficult. And that's actually also a personal question, like, who's going to police that owners are reporting correctly? And we have the same challenge today, where we're requiring owners to report in the consumption when they have been on a Trafigura voyage from last ballast to load to discharge. We're relying on the owner's data. So there are some uncertainties that we need to overcome, and standardization, like the Sea Cargo Charter, ideally should help this. I don't know if I answered your question in full, but sort of talking around the Grant.
No, it's good. But I think, the reporting is a very important aspect, and I think Rob will probably come in with this next session. But the fact is, over a longer period time charter, if you as a charterer chartered a ship with an A or B rating and want that ship to maintain that rating, how do we work that out in terms of if you constantly have to improve efficiency of the vessel? Whereas our charterer is going to be making a contribution to maintain that rating, or do we work with some other mechanism? But maybe, Robert, I can bring you in here. You're sort of better versed in these technicalities than me. So.
Thank you, Grant. It's usually complicated, actually, and I think one of the things that we need to remember is that the rating reflects the operational performance last year. That's a combination of the charter's requirements, the charter's utilization of the ship, the speed instructions and what have you, wind and weather, and all kind of things. What it does not say anything is about what the ship can do. So if you say you have this ship, which was unfortunate, it was transporting marble all the time, very heavy cargo. So it was sitting deep in the water. It had very little ballast voyages because, unfortunately, the charter was hugely efficient at avoiding ballast voyages. And it also ran into bad weather all the time, and by the way, was instructed to go fairly high speed. So you have all these combinations, which just on an AER metric, which is, as Roald said, likely to be the metric, but this ship will probably come out as an E ship, respectively. It does not mean that the ship cannot next year be an A ship. And that's the thing, it's not saying anything about future capability. That's where we have the design index sitting there, where we have a normalized standard set of evaluating the ships. Much like what we do on cars, there is a standard way of determining the fuel consumption of a car. Well, we all know we cannot meet it in real life, but we know that a model that exhibits a better fuel rating than another car is likely also in service to exhibit that better rating. So that's why we have the EDI is saying something about the chartering situation. You can say, what is the capability of this ship? Then we have this operational rating, which is a rating that tells you something about how did it then go in real operation. And that's where we now have this draft new requirement that we have to improve this performance all the time, which is fine, because that's what we have. We have to improve our performance all the time to meet the targets. But when we have a regulatory instrument, a mandatory instrument in place, the variables, the handles you can use to get better is the handles that will be used to get better. And if those handles are pointing to something that is actually not really sustainable in terms of total fuel consumption in the fleet, then we have a problem. If it leads to more ships being built, for example, than was otherwise necessary to carry the cargo at the same speed, because we don't want to utilize the whole capacity of the ship anymore to have a better seemingly fuel consumption in operation, then we are on the wrong track. So that's why I'm saying we have to be careful about what we do. We have to understand fully what we do. The other aspect is, of course, that for a ship owner, you need the charter to play along to help you improve your operational performance, your carbon efficiency, and that could be by reducing speed. It could be by other means of operational performance improvements. And if the charter decides not to do that, then we have another problem, because when you let go of the ship that was on charter, you end up with a rating for last year which is not very good. It might be non-compliant, and yes, there are no consequences. The question is, will it stay like that? Is that acceptable to put in place a global mandatory instrument that requires something with no teeth? I think that's probably a bit naive to think that that is going to last beyond at least the revision process. So that's why we need the charterers to play along here and help the owners maintain and do the necessary improvements. They cannot do it alone.
Yeah. We're kind of running towards the end here, but have you got anything you want to come back on Robert's handles there, Rasmus? If you have any comments on those?
I can talk a lot about it in terms of, I mean, owners have the principal sort of responsibility to optimize, and everything in our book has to happen on an equal level playing field. One of the challenges I can see, and there's so many good things about it, so it's really very positive, but one of the challenges I can see is when you time charter a ship and then you don't know yet what the consumption and the rating was from the last year, because you take delivery later after you charter it. There's just some complexity around it, but it's all something that everybody needs to be very, very dynamic around, because the requirements are changing as we come along, and they're changing very fast, which is positive, but it is a very dynamic space as of today, and it will not change onwards.
Lovely. Okay, thank you, Rasmus. Now, I think Menelaus, you have a question from our audience that you'd like to share with the panel.
Yes, I do, and thanks to Georgi Georgakiev for a couple of questions that he's thrown up. The first one, which I think is to everybody, is that burning some of these green fuels, for example, ammonia, could result in NOx emissions. How can these new fuels be environmentally friendly? And I think as a second question, which is a bit of a cat amongst the pigeons, it's shipping emissions contribute about 3% of the total in global emissions. Has anyone thought about the cost per percentage in decreasing shipping emissions? As cynically, one might say that if the cost efficiency per percentage of decrease of other industry sectors is substantially lower, humanity could afford to run on heavy fuel oil and invest in reducing the emissions in industry sections which contribute 10, 20 or 30% of CO2 emissions. And it would be interesting to see what your views are on that.
I can start.
Yeah, go ahead, please, Rasmus. It's a very
all industries now. All industries needs to decarbonize. So it's not about where money can best be put. All money needs to be put into decarbonizing all industries. Full stop. And I leave my answer to that and from that question.
Okay, thank you, Rasmus. Robert, you want to add
just to echo what Rasmus just said, I think that this whole idea of offsetting and paying somebody else to do it is a very, very short-term perspective of this issue. It's a very temporary thing, and we need all sectors need to decarbonize to meet the Paris Agreement temperature goals. So that's not a viable a way to stall, you could say, the necessary development that we need to have in place to decarbonize the shipping industry in all circumstances. So.
All right, thank you, Robert. Roel?
I agree. I think I may have to be a little bit more nuanced in the sense that obviously the IMO strategy came about because the Paris Agreement did not speak specifically about reducing aviation and shipping emissions. But I do think that the question is pertinent, and we will see it reflected in the end of the day in the positions of the member states represented at IMO. They are the ones that are going to agree on the revised strategy. And I'm sure that in the back of their head, they will have these kind of questions about what is the most cost-effective way of reducing emissions as part of their negotiation mandates. So, and we see more and more countries, including the US today, I think you mentioned that right at the start, about the very ambitious revision of the IMO's greenhouse gas strategy. So we hope, of course, that more and more countries will come with such a mandate to the negotiation table. But I don't have a glass bowl. We'll see what will happen. COVID is something that has largely impacted the discussions in IMO in the last year. So that will have to be taken into account as well on how certain groups of countries will respond and take that into account when we come to the revision of the strategy. But I'm optimistic, and I think having listened to Robert and Rasmus today, they share that optimism.
Lovely, thank you, Roel. Right, well, I had to bring this webinar to an end, unfortunately. I know there were a few more questions, and unfortunately we don't have time to go through them. I think it's been a very good and very enlightening session. I think we've had some really good discussions, and I thank all the people in the audience who did put those questions to the panelists. I think they were excellent questions. And I'd just like to thank, on behalf of the London Shipping Law Centre's chairman, Dr. Leke Shepherd, thank you to all our panelists to today. Thank you for my co-organisers as well, for I think was an excellent session. And of course, thank you very much to the many people from around the world. And this really was a global session. I had to look at the delegates list beforehand. I think at one point we had about 180 people here from all over the world, some of them staying up late to watch this. So we're very grateful to you for that. The event has been recorded, so if you're suffering from sleepless nights, we'll release a recording for you soon. But otherwise, thank you very much indeed for joining us, and goodbye.